You and I live in the most consumer-driven society in the history of the planet, where we're told that if we're going to be happy, we need more. All around us, advertising tells us we don't have enough, we need something else. And we get conformed to this way of thinking. Is there a different way to think? Is there a different grid to view the world through? That's what we're going to explore today. We're going to explore how consumerism shapes us, and amongst that, what's it look like to live by what Jesus calls a kingdom grid, where there's a different set of values, a different set of priorities. In Romans 12, it outlines what it calls living as a living sacrifice that grows and serves and shares and connects and worships. These things are often destroyed in consumer culture. And so together today, we're going to explore consumerism, but we're going to explore also a different way of doing life, a different way of being human. You and I live in the most consumer-driven culture in the history of the planet. What's that mean? It means our culture all around us gives us implicit messages. We just grow up thinking that consumerism is the grid to give our life to. It's the pool we're swimming in. What's consumerism? Well, consumerism isn't simply having more stuff. Some people have a lot of stuff, relatively, but score low on consumerism. Some people have a lot less stuff, but score high on consumerism. So consumerism isn't how much stuff I have. In fact, consumerism is my attachment to what I don't own yet. Because thousands of times a day, from the back of the bus, from billboards, from my computer screen, from my phone, from newspapers, from magazines, I am told that I am not enough, that there's something wrong with me, that I need something more, and I would be happy if I had the next thing, the next product, the next experience. Advertising is designed to make me unhappy with what I am now, and it tells me that if I had this or that, then I would be happy. But here's the problem. Because I can find myself getting conformed by these messages. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 12, 1-3, he says, we get conformed by the pattern of this world. The pattern of this world, consumerism, conforms me to think that the better version of me, the place to put my hope, the place to seek desire is in products, in commodities. And so I drift to think that way and start thinking that if I had this, if I looked like that, if my teeth were whiter, if my hair was bouncer, if my skin was clearer, if I had this car and not that one, if I had this phone but not that one, then somehow I'm going to be a better version of me. And so I start finding myself putting my hope and desire in things, and I start chasing this consumer grid. A few years ago in Shepparton, Australia, there was a greyhound race. I don't usually talk about greyhound races when I'm talking, but it caught my attention on the news because in race 8, there was all these greyhounds chasing a fake bunny. They go around the track chasing a fake bunny. But in Shepparton, a real bunny hopped onto the track in front of the greyhounds and went racing across, and out of these 8 greyhounds, one greyhound, Jenna Lou, turned on her heels to chase the real bunny, while the rest of the greyhounds did laps chasing a fake bunny that even if they got it, they wouldn't want it anyway. Jenna Lou turns on her heels, she's out of there, she jumped over the edge of the track and chases the real bunny. I don't know if she ever got the real bunny, but I remember watching this story thinking, go Jenna Lou, because when you saw the real, you had the sense to chase after it. You and I can go weeks into months, into years, and we can spend our time chasing the wrong grid that even if we got it, would we want it anyway? The consumer grid is simplified in the equation that time equals money, Money equals things, and things equal happiness. Because in consumer culture, the goal is to be happy. I just want to be happy. And if I had this or that and not this and not that, then I'm going to be happy. How am I going to be happy? If I had more things, then I would be happy. You know that if you won lotto, you'd be happy, right? Well, Robert Banks does a whole lot of research on this and talks to lotto winners, and sure, there was a spike in happiness for a moment, but pretty soon they had gone back to the happiness they had before, or often less. But you and I think, if I had that opportunity, I know I'd be happy because that would solve all my problems and I would be fine. The reality is, over and over again, we're told that things are going to equal happiness. There's a difference, by the way, between happiness and joy. When Paul writes about counting all things joy, he's talking about a different thing to happiness. But in our culture, happy is the goal. So how am I going to get more things? Obviously, I'd get more things if I had more money. So my goal becomes getting more money. But you and I grow up knowing that time equals money. Time equals money, money equals things, things equal happiness. We don't ever really articulate that grid, but in our minds we find ourselves living as if it was true anyway. Here's the problem with that grid. When we live by the time equals money, things, happiness grid, then whatever takes my time, takes my opportunity to earn more money, takes my things, takes my happiness. As I say, we don't articulate it that neatly, but that's the grid we end up living by. And there's some big implications to this. Because when I think time equals happiness, then whatever takes my time, I think is a threat to my happiness. So, getting involved in my community, building relationships with the people in my street, it takes my time. So in my thinking, in this consumer grid, it takes my happiness. And here's one of the challenges, because where consumerism goes up, connectedness goes down. And societies that score high on consumerism score lower on connectedness. Oliver James, a sociologist, researched various cultures across the planet. He measures them on a consumer grid and measures them on a connectedness grid. As consumerism goes up, connectedness goes down. Why? Because as consumerism goes up, I become more concerned with me rather than us. I can become more concerned with what I am getting and what's happening in my life rather than community. And so I don't have time for relationships because time equals money, money equals things, things equal happiness. So therefore, we live in a more individualized, less community-oriented society. And the very things that likely would bring us happiness, in this case relationships, are the things that get left behind. What about serving? What about serving in my community? What about serving in my church? What about serving in my family? Serving takes my time. Therefore, by this consumer grid, it takes my happiness. And so once again, I am less inclined to serve because I live in a culture that puts me at the center and says, serve me, rather than I serve. What about marriages? They take time. What about parenting? It takes time. And it starts getting silly. But the very things that only will deliver a life of significance are the very things that I sacrifice with the goal of somehow getting ahead. So consumerism causes a whole lot of challenges. In consumerism, it gets individual. It's all about me. In consumerism, I separate from the biggest story of us to focus on me. In consumerism, I become focused on things over relationship, things over people. I give my life to a different grid. In consumerism, I undermine community and I end up consuming people. I turn people into products to serve me and make me happy. I treat people as things. It teaches me to think in short-term sound bites about what I want because I don't have time for the bigger story of people, of culture, of religion. I live a shallow skimming life, supposedly delivering happiness, but instead, it just becomes a life given to commodity. I want endless choice, I want endless things. So, amongst all this, what does this mean for what you're chasing? Because here's the reality, as Paul says, we get conformed to the pattern of this world. Eugene Peterson's Message paraphrase says, we fit in without even thinking. We get dragged down to this society's level of immaturity. And reality is, we can know there's a problem with this, but at the same time, I can start chasing that same grid. I can start running around doing laps like a greyhound chasing a fake bunny. I can put all my time and energy into playing this game of Monopoly where I'm getting more things. But as Jesus asked, what does it profit if you gain the whole world, if you own the whole board, if you won the whole game of Monopoly? What's it profit if you got everything, but you lose your soul? There's another grid, and Jesus talks about there's another thing that's worth you giving your life to. And in a world that's all about me, Jesus talks about a community of us. So what's a different grid look like? What would it look like to push back against the consumer grid? And what about in a world that's time equals money equals things equals happiness, what do we do to address that? Well, one really good practice, one really good heart-building habit, one really good strategy for addressing consumerism, amongst other things, is this idea of Sabbath. Because on Sabbath, time does not equal money. On Sabbath, I put a gap between the time and money equation. And time equals relationship with God, relationship with others. On the Sabbath, it's not about what I'm going to produce. I take a break from production and work. On the Sabbath, it's not what I need because I take a break from shopping. I take a break from consuming. I take a break from having to get more. On the Sabbath, I disengage from consumerism, disengage from advertising and work and the need to get more, disengage from all these things. It's not that they're necessarily bad, but I disengage with that because that grid can crowd out the deeper grid, which is relationship with God, relationship with others. The grid of community, the grid of connectedness, the grid where I grow in knowing God and others, the grid where I worship God rather than self, the grid where I serve in my church family, in my community, in my immediate family, the grid where I connect deeply with others, the very things that consumerism can crowd out. So, I take a break from consumerism, I disengage to engage. Disengage into what those aspects are in life that Jesus teaches matter for eternity, the different grid, the grid of being fully human. And you might say, but we're going to consume. And yes, you will. You need clothes. You need some sort of transport. You're going to eat food. You are going to consume. But you consume with different glasses on. You consume not because you're finding your definition of yourself in there. You consume not because your identity is tied up in your next purchase. You consume not because you think the better version of yourself is in the next product. Sure, you're going to consume, but you're consuming for different reasons. Consumerism serves a relational grid rather than relationships being destroyed by a consumer grid. So Sabbath is a practice that breaks the consumer grid and instead engages in relationships that matter. Growing, serving, connecting, sharing, worshipping. That's the grid that Sabbath reminds us of. And that grid, by taking this break in time to remind ourselves why we're on this planet, to remind ourselves we connect with God, we connect with others, it gives different glasses to why we go about the rest of our week. What's another tool to address consumerism? Death. Death addresses consumerism. Why? Because when you die, you don't consume so well then. In fact, you get consumed. This is why in consumer culture, Mark Sayers says, we are death avoidant. In his book, The Trouble with Paris, he says, you and I live in a culture that wants to avoid death. Why? Because death reminds us how hollow this consumer grid is. When you're sitting facing death, all those things you've accumulated, the monopoly board you've put together, the things you've chased, all those things you thought did matter are shown for what they really are. In the face of death, people talk about, I wish I'd poured more time into relationships. They're not talking about putting more effort into generating more stuff. At that point, they start seeing life. So, consumerism wants to avoid death. This is why in consumer culture, we worship young people and everyone in our advertising is young and beautiful with white teeth and all those wonderful young attributes. In some cultures, the older you get, the more regard they give you. And they will put you at the center of the village because you know all the stories of us. In consumer culture, we put our old people away because they are no longer working at their consumable best. And instead, we focus on young people and we do all kinds of things and have all kinds of cosmetics and all kinds of procedures to keep you looking young so that at 40 you can be 20, at 50 you can be 20, at 60 you can be 30. We want to keep you young because that means we don't have to face where life is going. Gary Hopkins has done a longitudinal study, he's at Loma Linda, does a longitudinal study that looks at children who serve. He looked at children who served in an old age home, where they saw where life was going, where they saw the reality of life. And they end up being less consumer driven and more likely to be not involved in at-risk behavior, but less consumer driven. Why? Because they saw life. And in a consumer culture that target markets and keeps generations apart, what's it look like to be together? Where the wisdom of years and the enthusiasm of youth create an usness. So Sabbath addresses consumerism, death addresses consumerism. Being involved in creation has been shown over and over to reduce consumer attachment. Because when you see creation, you see these amazing things happening. You see that this is my Father's world, and you didn't even pay for that amazing sunrise and sunset. You realize you're not in control. You realize there's this whole life going on that is this different grid. And when you take time to engage in creation, when you take time to celebrate God's creativity, you're less inclined to be consumer driven. What else addresses consumerism? Serving. Because serving breaks that me-focused grid. When you get involved in serving, when you live a life beyond yourself, when you get involved in serving in your own home, serving in your community, serving in your church, when you get involved in doing stuff for someone else without expectation in return, get involved in serving, you're less likely to be consumer driven. Because when you're engaged in serving, you get a satisfaction, it comes back to you. Not that you're serving to get that feeling, but you start seeing there's a different way of doing life, there's a different way of being human. Here's the thing. Paul summarizes this really well in Romans chapter 12. In Romans chapter 12, he talks about there's a different way of being human. Now, Paul's not talking about consumerism. Consumerism wasn't the thing that he was trying to sort out. And you might think, I blame everything on consumerism. Well, I do. But reality is, consumerism is nothing new. Consumerism embodies the selfishness that's always been the problem, right back from the Garden of Eden. It's always been selfishness that destroys community. It just so happens that consumerism is a system that can institutionalize that selfishness. So selfishness has always been the issue. That's why the Apostle Paul says, I die daily to self. That's why the Apostle Paul says, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing unto God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Rather than a worship focused on self, it's a worship focused on God as a living sacrifice. Then Paul moves on. And in Romans chapter 12, he explores what it is to serve. See, there's a different grid. And you and I can get messages every day telling us to give our life to this grid of commodity and things. Or we can take a pause and think, what am I living for? What am I giving my life to? What's going to be significant? There's a big difference between success and significance. Our consumer culture focuses on being successful. Be successful. How do we measure that? We measure that in what we accumulate. I'm successful because I live in this suburb, I drive this car, I wear this brand. In a society obsessed by success, and whether you're successful or not, whatever, as long as you don't tie up your identity in your success. But amongst all that, there's a different grid, there's a different reason to keep going. It's significance. Significance are those things that matter for eternity. And that's people. That's community. That's relationship with God. That's relationship with others. That's investing your life into family, friendships. That's investing your life into neighborhood. That's investing your life into people, because people are what matter. There's a different grid that grows and serves and connects and shares and worships. It's a life of significance. Significance matters for now and matters for eternity. Whether you're successful, whatever. If you have generated a lot of things, great, use that to build community. But significance matters for now, and significance matters for eternity. Against a grid that focuses on me, what's it look like to be a different human that focuses on relationship with God, that flows through us to impact relationships with others? What's it look like to live a grid of significance rather than simply success? Let's pray. Dear Lord, as we come to you today, we live in a world giving us all kinds of messages of what it is to be successful. A world that puts the focus on me. Amongst all that, may I not become increasingly selfish, but may I be a living sacrifice who grows and serves and shares, connects and worships. May I live a life of relationships that make a difference for eternity. Amen.